Right now in Israel, the World Jewish Congress hosting today in Tel Aviv a special conference on fighting anti-Semitism on social media and attempts to delegitimize Israel on the internet, an issue that has popped up in recent weeks and in recent days, especially with President Donald Trump's speech on Jerusalem. Now, joining me and tracking this is Professor Gerald Steinberg with Bar-Ilan University. Thanks so much for being with us, Professor. Let's start with this developing story right now, tracking documents and social media content and that kind of thing. The Union of French Jews for Peace in France put out a new document involving the Prime Minister, already raising a lot of eyebrows around the world.
One of my other hats is the head of NGO Monitor. We follow the statements, the claims, the campaigns made by non-governmental organizations around the world. In France, we've got this organization which came across our radar a few months ago. They call themselves the Union for Jews for Peace. And it's very similar to the JV, the Jewish Voices for Peace in the United States. It's a fringe group. We have no idea. There may be 5 people, there may be 2 people. What's interesting is that they get money from the Prime Minister's office in France to put out really crude propaganda. So involved in this is a form of Holocaust inversion, if you will, in the sense of calling what Israel does a Nazi-like behavior, comparing Israel's situation with the Holocaust on the Nazi side. They abuse and they attack Zionism as a form of racism.
And the Prime Minister of France signs off on that?
The Prime Minister's office. And this is the out-of-control NGO funding, which is so typical of Europe. I'm going to guess that the Prime Minister himself has no idea, neither does the President Macron. Their money goes out to all sorts of fringe groups with no adult supervision. And that's extremely important and does a lot of damage.
We have some of the logos there from these groups on the screen now. But explain to me, especially because in public, the French government, especially the French Prime Minister, is appearing at speeches recognizing rising anti-Semitism and the need to combat it, and yet the French government is funding a lot of these controversial extreme NGOs.
There's a lot of money out there. We're talking about maybe tens or even more millions of euros every year that goes out to organizations that submit an application that somebody knows, that's controlled by a desk officer way down in the hierarchy, and under the title of fighting racism. So they put together the words that seem to work, that they're fighting racism. That's what you saw on the logo. But what's the definition of racism? The definition of racism is Zionism, it's Israel. That's where the lack of adult supervision comes in. It's all this money. Sometimes you'll see it going to groups like Amnesty International. There's a group called the Federation for Human Rights, International Federation for Human Rights in France, does similar things, leading the campaigns against Israel in Brussels. All this money's out there, and whoever makes the decisions does not do it with its due diligence. And so if this is brought up to the attention of the Prime Minister, there's no way this money can continue to flow.
Let me pivot from that. Speaking of the lack of, you call it, adult supervision, with defining these terms, racism, and you know, I mean, online, there's no adult supervision at all, especially in recent days and recent weeks with regards to the Trump speech. How has that kind of manifested Zionism into outright Jew hatred online? How do you combat that?
You mentioned the conference that's ongoing, jointly sponsored by the World Jewish Congress and NGO Monitor, just a little bit up the street here in the Tel Aviv port area. Not too far. And we're discussing exactly those issues. First of all, how is it manifested? And then if you have a diagnosis, how do you go after that? And there's no simple answer. How do you muster enough forces to name and shame the people who are doing this?
But some are saying, on Twitter, let's say, the lack of who's verified, who's not. How do you know what
Anonymous.
to do?
There's so much anonymous fake news out there, whether it comes from a Russian Twitter machine or Facebook or some other source. There are lots of them out there, and anti-Semites have a very easy access. So one of the questions is, do we need to push for an end to anonymous postings? If you write an article in a newspaper, you write an op-ed piece, your name's on there. You're responsible for what's said, and so are the editors. Somehow social media has gotten away from that responsibility. So one of the questions that we've raised is whether anonymity needs to be ended, and if so, how do we go about creating enough of a awareness of the dangers of anonymous posting, including racism, including these kinds of vicious attacks, and particularly the volume of anti-Semitic tweets, Facebook postings, and similar attacks.
And this conference being co-hosted right now by the World Jewish Congress, happening at the Tel Aviv port. More information on our website. Sir, thank you so much for being with us.